So, welcome everyone. My name is Larry Cole, and I'm host of COVID Impact 360 Conversations on this podcast. And today I have back again Doc Roy. He's the Chief Science Officer of our company, COVID Impact 360. And the reason why Roy's back today is a couple of months ago we did um, a 1 hour session on the history of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, and COVID-19, which is the disease of that virus. And out of that 1 hour, we got back some really good questions from listeners, and Roy felt strong enough about this that we should take each question and turn those questions into a video. So I've actually verbatim taken the questions. I'm going to give Roy the question right now. We're on question number 9, and it came from a Ricky B. And he said, "I am not sure that I understood what you were saying about the recent pandemics. It did not include the Ebola pandemic of West Africa. Could you please go over that section again for me?" Take it away, Roy.
Yeah, certainly, Ricky. And I think it's Ricky D, not Ricky B. So, Ricky, understand that in that first talk about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 2 months ago, I was only giving you the brief history of pandemics that were caused by respiratory viruses and not any other kinds of viruses. So I'll review them again for you. They should only take a minute, okay? And I'll go back to the original big one in 1918. But understand that these are only respiratory viruses. And as it turns out, they're simply coronaviruses or influenza viruses, okay? And we'll just review them. So in 1918, we had a Spanish flu pandemic, which was caused by influenza A, H1N1, that came from a spillover from birds, and at least 50 million people died in that pandemic. Many say it's as high as 100 million. But most of us believe 50 million is at least a minimum number. We had another pandemic, this time the Asian flu pandemic in 1957, and it killed 1 million people. Had another one 10 years later, actually 11 years later, in 1968, the Hong Kong influenza pandemic. Another million people died in that pandemic. The next respiratory virus pandemic we had was in 2002, 2003. Here's where I think you got confused in the original video, because I actually jumped around this. I put them out of order. I'll try and correct that now. In 2000, 2003, we had what is now called SARS-CoV-1. It used to just be called SARS-CoV because we didn't know there was a number 2. So it's now called SARS-CoV-1. And in that pandemic, 774 people died. But it had a high case fatality rate of about 10%. In 2009, and here again, we had the swine influenza pandemic that started in Mexico. And guess what? It was influenza A, H1N1 again. Same as happened in 1918, except this time it came from pigs and not birds. Okay? And it's also now in every seasonal influenza vaccine, there will always be the latest version of influenza A, H1N1 included in that vaccine. Okay? So it's been, and we've started doing that in 2009 after this pandemic. So it's called the swine influenza pandemic and started in Mexico, and 284,000 people died. Okay? The next pandemic was another coronavirus, the second coronavirus pandemic, and it started in 2012, and it's still ongoing at a very slow rate, and it was called the MERS-CoV pandemic, and that stood for the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus Pandemic. And to date, there have been 858 deaths, and it's involved all of the Middle Eastern countries, as well as 2 countries in Asia, which there were more than a few cases in South Korea, and we also ended up having a case in Japan. And of course, then we have the present day pandemic. So we have December 2019 to present, we have what we call the COVID-19 pandemic. It could also be called the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And so far, the official figures say that we've had 7 million deaths. Now, I'll put a couple of little asterisks beside that 7 million deaths because I don't believe that that's anywhere near the real number of deaths that occurred globally from SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the disease. So I hope that helps you out, Ricky. And remember, I'm just giving you the history of the respiratory virus pandemics. And I want you to notice one other thing here. There obviously, initially from the start to 1918, we jumped up to 1957. But as you start going down that list, each pandemic gets closer and closer and closer together. So if you look, 2002, 2003, then 2009, then 2012, then 2019. So we are now in 2025.
That's
Based
that's
on the
pretty good.
sequence,
Yeah.
we're due for another respiratory pandemic now, while we're still dealing with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. So anyway, that is the list of all of the respiratory virus pandemics in the 20th and 21st century today.